All right, Assalamu alaikum. This is going to be 4.03 Introduction to Ecosystems. All right, so let's go ahead and begin this one here. So we're going to be talking about ecosystems and populations, populations of animals, and how the population of one animal can affect another animal species. Right? So population dynamics. What does population dynamics means? It just means how population changes, over time, right? So, what is a change in population size and makeup within a given ecosystem? So there's multiple different species here, right? There's some giraffes, elephants, zebras, and many other species here. So how do they all go up and down, and how are they affected by the other species and other creatures, that live in the population, as well as how they're affected by the plant life, the weather, climate, the environment, how all those things interact to make the population numbers of each of these species go up and down. That's called population dynamics. So population in an area can change, right, due to many reasons, right? So one of the things that happens is that animal populations, they go in and out of a certain location, all the time. So, for example, there's many different kinds of seabirds. They will immigrate, right? Immigration means to go to an area. They will immigrate to an area, and then to an island in the Pacific or something like that, and they will lay their eggs there. And so they've basically immigrated there for a temporary period of time, right? And then from there they will emigrate. Emigrate means to leave. So then they will leave, right, that area once maybe the baby chicks have hatched and are able to fly on their own, and so now all the birds, they leave that island. So they've emigrated out of that island to go all over the place. So immigration, right? So there's always migration of species moving in and out of an area. Immigration is moving into an area. Emigration is a mass departure, right? It's someone leaving an area. So when one population immigrates to an area or emigrates from an area, then it affects all the other creatures that live there. So let's suppose there's a mass departure of coyotes from an ecosystem, right? So a coyote is a predator, right? So if the herbivores, the different kinds of animals that they eat, no longer have this predator, then the number of herbivores would suddenly increase dramatically because there's no coyotes to keep the numbers down. But so then what would happen then? Then the plants of that area would suddenly start to go down in number because the herbivores will start eating all the plants. And maybe, all the grasses, the trees, whatever it is that they're eating will suddenly decrease in population. So basically, there is, some kind of a balance between the different populations that live in an area. Another thing that can influence the population is the birth rate and the death rate. So birth rate means like how many of a certain species are being born, and the death rate is how many are dying. So for example, let's take a look over here at this section of the graph. In this section, you can kind of see that so this number right here tells you like how many are being born or dying per 1,000 elephants, for example. So here you notice in section 1, the birth rate and the death rate are basically about the same, right? The number of elephants that are being born in a certain period of time, like per month or per year, is the same as the number of elephants that are dying per month or per year. So what happens to the population? The population just remains stable, right? Because the number that are dying is the same as the number that are being born. So overall, the population remains the same. Now let's go to section 2. If you look at section 2, right, if we move up on the y-axis, you notice that the number of births at this time period is higher than the number of deaths, right? The number of deaths is maybe like 17 or something. The number of births is 25. So if the number of births is higher than the number of deaths, the population is going to start to increase, right? And so section 3, same thing. Birth rate is still above death rate. So the population in the red is still increasing. at this period of time in section 4, all of a sudden, it starts to even out again. They're both about the same, right? Now, the number of, the birth rate and the death rate is now lower than it was over here, but the important point is that they're the same. So therefore, the population, wherever it's at that time, basically starts to level out. So the birth rate and the death rate, that's very important. Now, within certain populations, like for example, other things are important as well. For example, the male to female ratio, right? That's important if, for example, in elephants, if there are a low number of females, right, then, and each of the, a mother elephant takes care of the baby elephant for like a long period of time. So if there are less females, then, and they're taking like a long time to raise each of these, baby elephants, then that's going to affect like how the population is growing. So they're giving us like an example. They're giving us a story of a population of moose and wolves in this national park. So this place called Isle Royale. So this is a national park in, I think, Michigan, right? So it's a national park in the state of Michigan. So over here, right, there's a lot of wolves and moose. Now, the interesting thing here, the reason why they're studying like the population of moose and wolves is because this is basically like a closed system for them. That means that the wolves and the moose, they do not migrate to or from the island. Okay, so the moose here, they don't go somewhere else and come back and stuff like that, and same thing with the wolves. So whatever the population there is, that's basically strictly a result of what's going on in that specific place. So if the number of moose goes down, you can't say, oh, the moose went somewhere else. The moose are there, and so if the number went down, that just means that there's less moose. So this is just easy for them to study the population. So that's why they study it in this area. So it's saying that the moose population is affected by different things. You have predation, right? Predators, like the wolf, malnutrition, and disease. So the number goes down. It doesn't mean that, like more wolves are killing off the moose. It could be that they're not getting the nutrition they need. There's some kind of new disease that's killing them off, stuff like that. So they eat this, the leaves off of this tree. It's called the balsam fir, right? So it looks like this, and then this is like the individual leaves and stuff like that. I guess these are cones or something, like the seeds or whatever. So if there is if there's any problem with this fir, then the population of the moose also goes down. So when the balsam fir is plentiful, the population will skyrocket. But when the food runs out, then malnutrition and disease set in, and the moose began to die. And so when they get sicker, then also it could make it easier for the wolves to get them as well. So there's multiple kinds of effects, going down. So the point is that the population goes up and down due to a lot of different effects, not because of predation, but also because of their own food supply. So if their food supply goes up, their population goes up. If it goes down, then their population also goes down. Now, let's suppose, the population of the wolves suddenly goes down, right? Well, the moose population is going to go up temporarily, right? But what happens, if you have more moose, they're going to eat more of these, fir trees. And then once these run out, right? Because if there's a lot more moose, they're going to be eating these up like a lot faster. It is not going to have time to regenerate. So once that happens, then the moose population is also then going to go down because they've eaten up all of their food sources. So there's a balance in between, the moose and the fir as well. So the moose cannot eat the fir, faster than the fir can grow back. Right? So this right here is kind of showing you, so there's different reasons why the population can go up and down. But if you take a look at this, take a look at, there's one pattern that you can see kind of in this area a little bit. So for example, here's the number of wolves, all right? So you notice that when the population of moose goes up, the population of wolves also goes up. So for example, when the population of moose starts to rise, right? Then you notice here the population of wolves, kind of after the moose population starts to rise, the population of wolves starts to rise as well in response, because now the wolves have more food. But when the wolf population gets too high, when it starts to increase and increase, then the moose population starts to go back down. Right? So this is one kind of, so there's multiple different factors, but this is, one kind of thing that you often see, is that once the prey starts to go up, then shortly after, the population of the predators starts to go up. But once that goes up, well, then the moose population goes back down again, because the wolves are eating the moose. But once the moose population goes back down, then again, the predator, his population follows. You see how the wolves, they also go down, because now there's less moose. The population of wolves is also going to go down. So the wolf population is affected by their prey population, as we saw in the previous graph, and disease. So one of the things is that there's not much genetic variation on this particular place, I think in Michigan. So if there's not much genetic variation, so when a disease hits a population, it doesn't hit everybody the same. It's the same thing with anything. It's the same thing with the flu, with malaria, with the bubonic plague, with the coronavirus. So people have different kinds of genes, right? Everyone's DNA is not the same. People's DNA is different. So there are some people who have, so everyone's slight difference in DNA makes them, slightly more or less resistant to a disease. So let's say the coronavirus. Maybe some people, they have genetics that makes them more susceptible to the disease, and they're more affected. Other people, right, they have, whatever the immune system is, it's better equipped to fight the coronavirus. So if you have, genetic variation, then what happens when a disease hits a population? Okay, it's going to kill off some of the members, but because there's variation, some of the animals are, strongly resistant to the disease, and they can survive, and even when the others die off, they can still survive to keep the species going. However, if you have no genetic variation, right, if pretty much all the animals are very, very similar in their DNA, then what happens? There could be a disease that hits and kills off like most of them, or even sometimes all of them, right? Because you don't have genetic variation where it just hits some of the population, but then other populations are different and stronger and able to resist. There could be a disease that just comes in, and because all the wolves are pretty much the same, it affects everybody the same and kills off a lot of wolves. So if you don't have genetic variation in the population, then it could be dangerous for that population. There could be a disease that comes in and just affects everybody. So we talked about the population of wolves and moose, right? So notice in this graph, right? So you notice over here that the population of moose over here suddenly starts to go up, go up, go up, right? Now you notice over here the population of wolves doesn't follow, right? So you would expect, remember in the previous graph we looked at it, you would expect that when the population of the prey goes up, the predators is going to follow soon afterwards because there's more prey to eat. But that's not necessarily the case, right? So what it's saying here is that, when the population of moose goes up, right, it also depends on how many of the moose are weak and old and sick, right? If the population goes up, but, all the moose are pretty much healthy, well, then the wolves are not going to be able to catch them still, right? Because the wolves, they usually go after those individuals that appear to be sick, appear to be, diseased, appear to have an injury, old, those kinds of things. So it doesn't. So generally, if the population goes up, the predator population also goes up because there's more things to eat. But that's not necessarily the case. Maybe if all of these are very healthy moose, well, the wolves are not able to catch them very much, and so their population basically remains down here. Now, one thing they're showing over here, they're showing here in the early 1980s, right? So you see the early 1980s, there was a sudden dip. So there was this new kind of virus, parvovirus, right? So it was brought by a park visitor's dog. So you see that suddenly, when this one virus came in, suddenly the population tanked. And that's because there's not as much genetic variation in the wolves as we discussed in the last slide. So if there's not much variation, this one parvovirus just came in and killed off most of the wolves. There wasn't like a whole lot of different kinds of wolf DNA where, the parvovirus just affected some of them and the rest could just keep going on. This just killed off most of the wolves. So that's why genetic variation is also important in a population. So this right over here, this is just kind of showing that, so this is like a whole bunch of, like every year, right? 1959, 61, 63, all these years, right? They're measuring the percentage of the population of the moose that is senescent, meaning old, prime age, meaning basically young and healthy, and calves, which are very young. So you notice over here, like for example in 1959, right? There's a certain percentage that are calves, that are the babies. Most are in the prime age, and a few are old. Over here, 1981, right? You have some calves, prime age, but then there's a whole lot of old moose over here. So, it's not just about the number of population. It also depends on, the ages and the condition of the moose as to whether the wolves can catch them. So over here in 1959, probably the wolves had a hard time catching most of these moose. You see, most of them are in their prime age. They're able to run fast. They're healthy, right? They can get away quickly. Not very many are old or young, where they're weak and slow and stuff like that. But over here in 1981, right? Take a look over here, right? The number of calves is still small, but the number of old, moose is very high. The percentage of the population is very high. So what does that mean? It means that, there's a good chance that in this year, the wolves were able to, catch, a lot of the moose, because there's a lot of very old, moose as well. So the important thing is not just the population number, but what is the condition of the population? Are they young? Are they old? Are they strong? Are they weak? Is there disease going around, right? That's also important to consider. All right, so we have, the habitat, right? So what is a habitat? It's like basically where the animal lives, right? The habitat provides food, water, and breeding areas, right? So, for example, in this habitat, right, an elephant has a very long gestation period. So basically, it raises the baby elephant in its womb for a long period of time, and then afterwards, it also takes a long time for the baby elephant to be raised. So, what's important when you look at how the population is doing is the rates of deaths and the rates of births, right? So, for example, it's saying that 1 birth to 10 deaths does not help an endangered population grow. So, if 1 calf is being born, but poachers or illness or whatever is taking 10 of them away, right? Then, that's not good, right? That's going to make the population go down. So we can't just look at how many elephants are being born to see what's going to have to happen to the population. Maybe one year there's like a lot of elephants being born. So we can't assume that therefore the population of elephants is going to grow, because maybe like a lot are dying off as well. Maybe a lot are being hunted. There's habitat loss, illnesses for whatever reason. There's a drought or something, and maybe a lot more are dying off as well. So you have to look at the combination of the birth and the deaths. So there's this concept called carrying capacity. So what is carrying capacity? What is carrying capacity is basically, kind of like the maximum amount of a certain species that the environment can hold. So for example, let's suppose there's a forest, right? And, it has a carrying capacity of 75 moose, right? So what does that mean? That basically means that 75 moose is basically kind of like the maximum amount of moose that can really live in that area, and it lives in a sustainable way, right? Where it's not just consuming all the food, and all the trees are going away because they're eating everything. That's like the maximum amount where it can kind of sustainably live. So if 6 are being born and only 1 dies per year, then the population is going to go up by 5, right? So the next year, there's going to be 80 moose. So this is above the carrying capacity. So that environment cannot sustain 80 moose for a very long period of time. Pretty soon, this extra amount of moose, the 5 extra moose, the biological surplus, right? They're going to start to eat, more of the trees, more of their food than they really, I guess, should be eating. So then their own food is going to start to go down, and eventually the number of moose is going to have to either migrate, or they're going to risk starvation and they're going to die. So if 75 is the carrying capacity, anything beyond that is the biological surplus, and those are kind of extra. They need to go away somewhere, or basically, some moose are going to start to die off because that habitat cannot sustain 80 moose. It's only built for 75 moose, right? So how is the carrying capacity determined? So to determine, okay, what is the carrying capacity of a certain place, you have to kind of graph the population over time, and then look at the pattern on the graph. So we're going to look at some example patterns, and look at this thing, sigmoid and peak phenomenon. We're going to look at the graph and identify where is there sigmoid and peak phenomenon in the graph. So here's what happens, right? So let's suppose the population of something goes up, right? The population of moose suddenly goes to an area and it starts to increase. In the beginning, it's going to increase pretty fast, right? You see how this in the beginning is kind of like exponential growth, right? It's like curving up, all right? Well, it's growing very fast here. So whenever you see this, right, this usually means that there's like plenty of resources. It's not really close to the carrying capacity. So that's why it can shoot up dramatically like this over here. But as it starts to go up, right, it starts to kind of flatten out like this. It can't grow as fast anymore. So do you see this blue line? You see this blue line? We don't normally have this blue line. Here's what we have. We have the purple line. So the number of moose goes up here, it overshoots, right? It overshoots. It goes up too high above the carrying capacity. So what happens? It had to go back down. But once it goes back down and crashes a little bit, well, there's a little bit of room left. So we're going to start to go back up. It overshoots a little bit and goes back down. When it goes back down, well, we have some extra food now, so we go back up. So it's going up and down, kind of, around the carrying capacity like this, right? So once you graph it over time and you see a pattern like this, okay, the carrying capacity is somewhere over here. That's why it's going up and down right in that range. Sometimes it's just like a little bit too much, and then so it has to go back down. When there's a little bit too less, less than the carrying capacity, well, it has some room to grow, so it can grow back up again. So you kind of graph the purple over time, and based on that, you can figure out, okay, the blue line, that's probably where the carrying capacity of this population is. That's the maximum amount of population that this habitat can carry. So we have, different populations, they grow in a different manners. When you graph them out, they kind of grow in a different kind of manner. So for example, usually like small animals, like rabbits, right? They reproduce like very, very quickly. They have like a lot of children, and they grow like very quickly. And they show this kind of growth. This is called R selection, right? This exponential kind of growth. So this right here, right, is called R selection, right? So if you see a graph like this is R selection. K selection is usually more like larger, more complex animals, where it takes a longer period of time for the children to grow. So for example, large mammals like this, they grow in this kind of fashion. In the beginning, they could grow in the same kind of exponential kind of area pattern, but normally they follow this kind of more sigmoid kind of pattern, right? So this is called a peak. You notice how this looks like a peak, right? This is called a peak. This one in the yellow is called sigmoid. So we talked in the last one about sigmoid and peak phenomena. So this is more of a sigmoid pattern up here. This blue is just looks like a peak kind of pattern, right? Now over here in this picture over here, right, we have the carrying capacity, right? So when the carrying capacity is reached and it overshoots, it has to come back down, right? Now the carrying capacity, right, over here just looks flat over time, right? But the carrying capacity, can also change, right? Let's suppose something happens in the environment, right? Whatever, like maybe there's like a disease going through the plants, and a lot of the plants die. Well, then maybe there's not as many moose that you can carry in a certain population. So the carrying capacity itself actually can start to go down. So this blue line is not always right here at 1.5. The carrying capacity itself can also change over time. So if the carrying capacity goes down, that's called degraded carrying capacity. So the R selection and K selection, again, the graphs are shown here. R selection is usually more like rabbits and stuff like that. K selection is usually more complex kind of organisms. So when we look at these graphs, right, we on the left we have the sigmoid pattern, right, also known as K selection, like this. So this reveals that the carrying capacity, the sigmoid pattern reveals the carrying capacity at the stability point. So right over here, right, right over here when it starts to kind of curve back down, it's not growing as fast anymore. That kind of tells you a little bit about the carrying capacity, right? Because it's not growing as fast anymore. It's kind of approaching kind of the limit of its growth of that population, right? Now in the peak phenomenon, right, we see the R selection, right? Peak phenomenon looks like a peak, right? It's food resources guide population growth, but the natural tendencies that manage population size, like birth and death rates, don't stabilize the populations. So these kinds of things like rabbits, okay, that have this kind of growth pattern, right? They have booms and busts. That means in the K selection, you can see it's kind of like pretty much stable, right? It's not growing too fast or coming down too fast. It's kind of staying around the carrying capacity. When it comes to rabbits and lemmings and stuff like that, their numbers just like shoot up very quickly. These kinds of creatures, they produce like a lot of babies all at once, and they usually like way overshoot, and then it just crashes back down. You see how it's just like crashing back down quickly, right? The number of rabbits crashes back down quickly. It's not just kind of like up and down slowly. It shoots up like a boom and then busts, crashes down very quickly. So it booms when resources are readily available and then busts when resources run out. So usually the fact that the population shoots up quickly, that's one reason why it crashes so quickly as well, because suddenly you eat all the food up, food is now gone, population crashes because there's nothing to eat. Right? So the mortality rate leaves too few to reproduce. Right? So a boom and bust cycle can happen to any population. For example, lemmings, right? Usually, but small creatures like lemmings and rabbits, that's typically what the example is given. Lemmings can increase when vegetation is abundant, right? The predators can increase as well because there's more lemmings now. However, when there's a whole bunch of lemmings, all of a sudden there's competition for food, there's food scarcity, and the population crashes back down. So this is like a few like kind of like general characteristics for K selection, which are usually more complex kind of creatures, and R selection, which are rabbits, lemmings. So in K selection, usually they have a stable environment. So in a stable environment, they can afford to a species can afford to kind of have babies that take a long period of time to grow, right? That's one reason that, right? So as a result, their population is not going to be going up and down, up and down. In an unstable environment, or when the environment is unstable for this population, their strategy is that whenever the population kind of stabilizes, whenever there's some food, they just produce as many offspring as possible, right? If it's unstable for them, they can't really afford to like grow an organism for a long period of time. Like have a baby and then the baby, has to be raised. You have to take like a long time for it to raise. So in case selection, these are more complex creatures with longer life expectancy. R selection, like rabbits and lemmings, short life expectancy. And this is just showing the same thing, right? Rabbits are more to the left towards R. More complex creatures are more to the right towards K. So most creatures are not like purely K or purely R. They're usually like somewhere in the middle. So pure K and pure R. Those are the kind of the graphs that we show. But most creatures are somewhere on like a spectrum between R and between K. Right? This is kind of showing the same kind of thing. Whenever you see population growth like this is like usually either this is an R, an R selected kind of population, or this is like in the beginning stages of the growth when there's just like so much food, the population can just shoot up. When you're approaching the carrying capacity of the environment, it starts to kind of bend down like this again. The rate of growth starts to slow down again. And this is just showing lemmings, right? Lemmings, the population does go up and down. Now, when you have a population in an area, right, the population's like number, the population's number is controlled by what is called a limiting factor, right? So, for example, it's like this, right? Let's suppose you have a like some horses, right? So, and let's suppose horses, they need two things. Okay, so they need food and they need water. All right. So let's suppose the horses, they live in an area where there's like tons and tons of grass, right? There's like grass all over the place. All right. However, for water, there's only like a very small pond, okay, or something like that. Maybe that's just like a small bucket of water, right? So like food, right? Food, there's like plenty of food, right? And then, water, but this is like a little bit of water. So what is the limiting factor there? The limiting factor there is water. Why is that the case? Because like, let's suppose the horses are eating the food and drinking the water. Well, which are they kind of like running out of first? What is limiting their population number? It's the water, right? There's like a lot less water than there is food. So let's suppose they just keep eating and eating and drinking the water. So they're going to run out of the water first before they run out of the food. Once they've reached the limit of the water supply, there's still plenty of food left. There's not infinite food, right? If you increase like the amount of water a lot, right? You might increase the amount of water in an area so much that maybe now when the population grows, you run out of food first. Then the food would become the limiting factor. Basically, the limiting factor is whatever is kind of stopping the population from growing more than it's growing right now. So that doesn't mean that you have unlimited amounts of other things. It just means that what is the thing that's limiting the population right now? That's the that's the water. So populations are, so for example, when you have a plant, right? There's different kinds of limiting factors. Light intensity, for example, temperature, and carbon dioxide. So suppose suppose you have this plant, okay? So it's living in like a dark area, right? It's living underneath like some other trees. Well, there's plenty of carbon dioxide there, right? There's no shortage of carbon dioxide there, but it's not getting enough light. It's not getting like a whole lot of light. So basically this plant is kind of taking in as much light as possible. It's just taking in as much light as possible, right? And it's basically consumed all the light that's coming through. There's not much light coming through, but whatever's coming through, it's taking it in and consuming it and using it. And so, in addition, it's also using up carbon dioxide as well, right? Carbon dioxide is coming in to be used for photosynthesis. But there's like a whole lot of carbon dioxide kind of still left that's kind of waiting, that could be used if you just had like a little bit more light, right? So in that case, light is the limiting factor, whereas carbon dioxide is not. There's still plenty of carbon dioxide left over that could be used. It's ready to be used, but you need a little bit more light to use this carbon dioxide. So light is the limiting factor there. Now, this is an example. So most ecosystems are open systems, right? So what does that mean, open system? That means that matter and energy can come in and out, in and out. So for example, matter. What is matter? Matter is like stuff, right? It's like like water, nutrients, stuff like that. In most ecosystems, matter is coming in and out. There's animals coming in. There's new plant seeds coming in. Soil is coming in from volcanoes or from the river, different places. Right, nutrients are coming in, and then energy is also coming in and out. Like light energy is coming in from the sun. Energy is also leaving in the form of animals moving away and migrating away, and things like that. So, all right. So we've talked about this before. Abiotic factors. Remember, bio means like life. So A is like non-living. So these are non-living factors of an environment. So these are things like the temperature, like the amount of water, rocks, different minerals, those kinds of things that are not living factors in an environment. Those are called abiotic factors, right? So let's suppose you get to an area, right? Or let's suppose there's an area that is just new, right? It's like a new piece of land. So for instance, on the island of Hawaii, and many different islands in the ocean, like throughout the Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean, let's suppose a volcano suddenly erupts. Okay, so the volcano, right, erupts, and then what's going to happen is that when the lava comes out and cools, it forms a new piece of land. Now, there's nothing living on that land right now. There's no plants, there's no animals, because this rock was just formed. This island was just formed from cooled lava. Okay, so what happens, right? There's no soil. Right? There's not like a ready place there for living things to go there and live. Right? There's no soil there. There's not minerals. There's not plant life. There's not animals. There's not like a ready place for life to go there and live. So what happens is that there's something called primary succession that happens, that very, very slowly over time starts to develop that area so that it becomes suitable for life to live, right? So this is showing you an example of what's going on, right? So in the beginning, right, you just had like the volcanic rock or whatever it was, just bare rock, right? There's nothing there, just rock. But what happens is that slowly, in the beginning, you have just very simple kind of organisms, like lichens and things like that, maybe small kinds of mosses, they start to grow there. All they're using is some of the minerals from the rock. But as they grow there and they start putting their different, like tentacle kind of things, microscopic tentacle kind of things inside of there, what happens is that the rocks start to break down a little bit. And over a long period of time, these simple kind of organisms, they slowly start to break it down so that there's like maybe like a tiny amount of like soil-like thing on there, and then maybe some kind of like small type of plant or other lichens and moss, they can start to grow, and that further starts to break it down until slowly over time it becomes more and more suitable for larger and larger plants, until pretty much any kind of tree with large roots can live there. in the beginning, right, you can't have like a large tree live over here in the beginning, right? There's like barely any soil here, right? A large tree needs like a whole lot of soil, right? So this is called primary succession. So this process obviously takes like a long period of time. I mean, if you have nothing but rocks and you want to turn into this, well, this is, you're gonna have to first break things down slow. Different things break things down slowly until it gets to this stage. So the first plants are called pioneer plants, right? Like pioneers is like a person who goes to an area for the first time. So different pioneer plants, they break things down, and then more complex, larger plants can start to grow. Now, secondary succession. What is secondary succession, right? Primary means like this is the first time that life has ever lived there. Secondary means that there's a place that basically has kind of been destroyed. However, life used to live there, so that the area still is ready for life to live there again. So, for example, after the tsunami, like this whole area was destroyed, right? So all the trees and life was destroyed. So, but in this case, right, there's also already soil and stuff here, and so secondary succession is going to occur. So this process is going to take like a lot faster, right? So for example here, let's say a fire or a tsunami or something just destroys this whole area. No plants, nothing left, right? So in this case, again, you can have some pioneer species, smaller plants, and then over time larger plants. But in this case, the soil and everything that in the ground, most of it is still there. Most of it is formed. Most of it is ready. So this process is accelerated. This is going to take a lot, a lot less time than primary succession, because you're starting from a better, place. You're starting with all the soil and stuff ready for things to start to grow. So usually, when you had some kind of ecosystem, and then it got destroyed, well, the soil remains, and so it can recover more quickly than in the primary succession when you have to start from scratch. Right. So biotic factors, right? These are living things in the environment. So different organisms, they're always interacting amongst each other. And so each of them so there are different kinds of interactions between different kinds of species, right? So each organism lives in a kind of place within the ecosystem that's called a niche. So a niche is not necessarily like a physical place. It could be, like maybe there's, a creature that lives only in a certain kind of tree or something like that. So that could be part of it. But a niche is just kind of like the physical location, its function, its job, all those kinds of things that are kind of unique to that organism. So every organism kind of has kind of like its own, small, part of the ecosystem, its own niche. So there's different kinds of organisms, different kinds of interactions that can occur between organisms. So this one over here is called mutualism, right? So what does this mean? Two organisms interact, and both of them benefit from it, right? So species A benefits, and species B benefits. They both benefit. That's called mutualism. Commensalism is you have two organisms interacting, and one of them benefits, and for the other, there's no just unaffected. There's nothing good happens, no harm happens, just neutral. So the clownfish and sea anemone, they benefit each other. Over here, right, the barnacle is benefited by staying on the whale. The whale not harmed. Doesn't matter to the whale one way or the other, right? This is called commensalism. One benefits, the other unaffected. Parasitism, right? This is when one benefits, but the other is harmed, okay? So it's not like in the whale where the whale just doesn't care. Here, the dog does care, right? The tick is going to harm the dog and cause diseases and stuff like that. So this is called parasitism. Another one is called predation. Predation is when one basically eats the other. All right. So predation and parasitism in some ways are kind of similar. Like in one of them, one benefits and the other is harmed. But Parasitism is not usually when one thing kind of like eats the other thing compared to predation. All right. So whenever you go to a certain ecosystem, there's always different kinds of organisms that sort of natively live there, right? Like for example, in the Everglades, there's a kind of snail that has been living there for like more than like 1 million or 2 million years. So that's considered to be like a native species. But now from South America, people are bringing in other kinds of snails, and those snails are kind of taking over the habitat of the snails that are here in the Everglades, and so that's called an invasive species. They basically kind of very recently kind of appeared in that area, and usually an invasive species is what people usually call it that when a species goes to a new location because of human activity, right? So the new snails have been brought to the Everglades not because they sort of naturally migrated over somehow, but because human beings brought them over for some purpose and then released them into the wild, and so now they took over, something like that. So that's called an invasive species. So native species live there. Invasive species have recently invaded. Right? So they can cause all kinds of problems. They can take over and compete with the native species. Right? They can disrupt food chains, bring diseases that maybe there's some new disease that the native species is not used to, and so it can't handle that bacteria or virus or whatever it is. And this is just showing, an example. So there's a kind of vine called kudzu, and it has basically taken over, large areas of the southern United States. So this is from Japan. So this didn't come over naturally. People brought it over here, but then it got into the wild and now it's growing all over the place. And this is just showing some examples of different kinds of invasive species. So people, like different kinds of national parks and places, like wilderness areas, they usually have like lists of what are the invasive species in that location. And then people they sometimes try to get rid of them, but usually they're not able to really fully get rid of them. But sometimes they can control their numbers. Now this is just giving an example of commensalism. Now what is commensalism? Remember, this is where one benefits and the other doesn't care. Like the whale, right? The barnacle is on the whale. The barnacle benefits, but the whale doesn't really. It doesn't matter to the whale one way or the other. So the woodpecker, right? What it does is it creates all these holes in the trees, all right, to find food, right? So the woodpecker, once it creates holes in the trees to find food, other kinds of once it finds it pecks a hole into the tree, maybe it finds some insects, maybe it doesn't, but if it finds some and eats some, and then eventually it leaves, right? It goes away and tries to make another hole. It doesn't come back to the same hole again. It goes to another tree, makes holes somewhere else, and you're looking for food somewhere else. So the woodpecker, right, it leaves behind these holes. So these are habitats for other insects, such as habitat for other insects as well as other birds. So insects and other birds like owls, they benefit from what the woodpecker does, right? They benefit from the woodpecker's actions, right? Now, does the fact that they benefit from the woodpecker, does that help the woodpecker? Does it harm the woodpecker, or does it matter to the woodpecker? Basically, it doesn't matter, right? The woodpecker is off somewhere else doing its own thing. So the insects and owls, they're now benefiting from the woodpecker's holes, and then, but the woodpecker, it doesn't care. It doesn't need to go back and find more insects there. It goes somewhere else, and it just by itself, it's finding other insects somewhere else. So it doesn't care what these guys are doing on the tree that it left behind. All right, competition, right? So competition is if two things are kind of trying to sort of occupy the same kind of niche, right? So they're competing for the same food and also the same habitat. So they're competing for this. They could be competing for the same kind of food or the same kind of habitat, and so So they're basically, so this is not, I guess, competition could be considered not good for either one of the creatures. This is again giving examples of different kinds of symbiotic relationships, right? So this is talking about different kinds of birds and snails and that kind of thing. So it's saying that there are different kinds of birds called bulrushes, right? Sorry, not birds, plants. Different kinds of plants called bulrushes. So they produce seeds which are eaten by birds, stems which are eaten by ducks, and provide a place for apple snails to place their egg sac. So some of these things could harm the bulrushes, right? It could harm the bulrushes, like if you eat them and destroy the plant, it could harm the bulrushes. Other things, like apple snails putting their eggs next to the plant, it probably doesn't matter to the plant one way or the other. So with this one plant, there's all different kinds of relationships that are going on. Some beneficial to both, some harmful to some doesn't matter, that kind of thing. So in the real world, it's very, very complex. Now, here's an example. They're giving an example of predation, right? We talked about predation before. One thing is going to eat the other. So you have phytoplankton and zooplankton. So what is phytoplankton? Phytoplankton, basically, they make their own food, right? So these are tiny plankton. Plankton is like a microscopic kinds of organisms that just float around in the water. And the ocean current can take them. So phytoplankton, they're basically you could kind of think of them as kind of like microscopic plants. They make their own food. The zooplankton, right? Zoo means kind of like animal, right? Zoology, stuff like that. So this is kind of like animal plankton, animal-like plankton. So this plankton is called animal-like because they go and they eat the phytoplankton, or maybe smaller zooplankton. So these things basically eat, these things make their own food. So zooplankton are the predators, and then phytoplankton is the prey. Right? So this is called predation. This is just giving some different examples between phytoplankton and zooplankton. All right, so this is kind of like a summary of the different kinds of relationships. You have parasitism, where one benefits and the other is harmed. Commensalism, one benefits and the other doesn't matter. Mutualism, both benefit. Competition, right? Neither benefits because they're both competing against each other. And then neutralism, finally, where neither benefits or is harmed. So a human being may be unaffected by a roadrunner. So if a roadrunner is living, so this is assuming that the roadrunner's habitat is not taken over by the human being and stuff like that. Just assume that roadrunner is living over there somewhere in the desert, and human being is living somewhere else random, right? So what the roadrunner is doing over there doesn't matter to the human being. What the human being is doing over here doesn't matter to the roadrunner.